Nicole Harris had always considered herself a responsible and hardworking woman. As a 29-year-old single mother, she balanced her demanding job as a nurse at a local clinic in Southside Chicago with raising her 8-year-old son, Jay. Her days were long and filled with routine: morning school drop-offs, back-to-back shifts at the clinic, and evenings spent helping Jay with his homework. Life was tough but manageable, and despite financial struggles, Nicole found comfort in their small but cozy apartment. She had no reason to suspect that a single day would turn everything upside down. It started on a chilly October morning in 1998. Nicole was leaving the clinic after a 12-hour shift, exhausted but relieved to finally head home. The autumn wind bit at her skin as she pulled her jacket closer around her. As she approached her car in the dimly lit parking lot, she noticed the police vehicles before she heard the voices. Within moments, she was surrounded by officers. They didn't offer explanations, only swift, cold commands. Handcuffs clicked around her wrist before she could process what was happening. Panic gripped her as she was pushed into the back of a squad car, the flashing lights reflecting off the clinic's glass doors. At the precinct, Nicole learned the reason for her sudden arrest. She was accused of murdering Robert Wilkins, a prominent businessman found dead in his downtown office just 2 nights prior. The evidence, they claimed, was irrefutable: a witness statement placing her at the crime scene, and a grainy surveillance video that allegedly captured her entering the building. The footage showed a woman of similar height and build wearing a cap and a heavy coat. Nicole's protests of innocence were met with skepticism. The detectives didn't want to listen. Instead, they pressured her with aggressive questioning, emphasizing inconsistencies in her alibi and presenting falsified evidence to break her down. They told her that fighting the charges was futile and that the system would not work in her favor. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Nicole maintained her innocence. She explained that she had been at work the entire night, with time-stamped records and co-workers who could vouch for her presence. Her attorney, a public defender overburdened with cases, struggled to build a solid defense within the limited time before trial. He barely had time to review the surveillance footage and failed to challenge the inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements. The witness, a known transient with a history of providing questionable testimony, had originally described someone shorter than Nicole. However, this discrepancy was quickly dismissed by the prosecution. The trial was swift and unforgiving. The presiding judge, Richard Banks, had a long-standing reputation for handing down harsh sentences to African-American defendants. He was dismissive of Nicole's defense, refusing to admit crucial evidence that could have exonerated her, such as the clinic's security footage showing her at work during the estimated time of the crime. The jury, influenced by the prosecution's compelling but flawed narrative, took only a few hours to reach a verdict. On a cold November morning, Nicole stood in the courtroom as the judge delivered the sentence: 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Her legs felt weak, and the room seemed to close in around her. She turned toward the gallery, searching for a familiar face, but the absence of her family and friends only deepened her despair. Her son, Jay, had been taken into state custody, a thought that shattered what little strength she had left. The reality of losing everything she had worked for, her career, her dignity, and most importantly, her son, settled in like a crushing weight. As she was led away in handcuffs, Nicole's mind raced. How had her life unraveled so quickly? She had always believed in justice, in fairness, but now she realized how fragile those ideals were when faced with a system that saw her as guilty the moment she walked through its doors. The months ahead would be filled with isolation, regret, and an overwhelming sense of injustice. Nicole had entered the courthouse as a hardworking mother and nurse. She left as a convicted felon, her name forever stained by a crime she did not commit. Nicole Harris entered the Illinois Springfield Women's Correctional Facility with a heavy heart and an overwhelming sense of despair. The towering gray walls and the constant hum of electric fences served as a grim reminder that this place would be her reality for the foreseeable future. The intake process was cold and impersonal, stripping her of everything familiar: her clothes, her dignity, and any illusion of control she once had over her life. The prison uniform, stiff and ill-fitting, felt like a branding, marking her as nothing more than another inmate in the system. Life behind bars was harsher than she could have imagined. The daily routine was relentless and dehumanizing. Mornings began with the harsh clang of metal doors and the sharp bark of guards demanding inmates to line up for the head count. Breakfast was a bland, tasteless affair, served in the overcrowded cafeteria where whispered conversations and hostile stares filled the air. The guards enforced the rules with an iron fist, and any sign of defiance was met with immediate and often brutal punishment. In the early months, Nicole struggled to navigate the unwritten rules of prison life. Isolation and fear gripped her tightly, and she avoided eye contact, choosing instead to shrink into the background. Violence was a constant presence, lurking in every corner of the prison. Inmates formed cliques, each with its own hierarchy and codes of conduct. Nicole soon learned that stepping out of line, even unintentionally, could result in verbal abuse or worse, physical assault. She endured countless humiliations, from being shoved in the food line to having her belongings stolen from her bunk. The guards were no better. Some wielded their authority like a weapon, subjecting inmates to arbitrary searches, degrading comments, and unnecessary force. The relentless stress took its toll, and Nicole found herself withdrawing further into herself, plagued by anxiety and sleepless nights. Depression settled in like a thick fog, weighing down every aspect of her existence. She thought constantly of her son, Jay, picturing his face and wondering if he still remembered her. The letters she wrote to him were filled with desperate attempts to maintain a connection, to remind him that she was still his mother despite the bars that separated them. But as the months turned into years, the letters returned unopened, stamped with cold, impersonal words, "Return to sender." Each returned envelope was a dagger to her heart, reinforcing the reality that she was no longer a part of his world. By 2005, Nicole had learned to navigate the rigid structure of prison life. She found a small refuge in the prison library, a quiet escape from the chaos of the cell blocks. Initially assigned to menial tasks such as shelving books and cleaning tables, she gradually earned the trust of the prison staff and took on more responsibilities. It was in the library that she met Carl Johnson, an older inmate who had once been a respected defense attorney before his conviction for financial fraud. Carl possessed a quiet intelligence and an encyclopedic knowledge of the law, and he quickly noticed Nicole's curiosity about legal texts. Carl took an interest in Nicole's case, spending hours poring over her trial transcripts and court documents. Together, they uncovered numerous inconsistencies and procedural errors. The evidence presented at trial was flimsy at best. No concrete forensic proof, a questionable witness, and a glaring omission of her alibi. The discovery of these discrepancies reignited a spark of hope in Nicole, pushing her to take action. With Carl's guidance, she began drafting appeals and petitions, meticulously outlining every piece of mishandled evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. She sent these documents to legal aid organizations, innocence projects, and even the governor's office. But the responses, when they came, were formulaic rejections or outright silence. As the years wore on, Nicole's resilience was tested again and again. Each legal setback chipped away at her hope, but she refused to give up entirely. The routine of prison life continued, waking up, working in the library, enduring the daily indignities, and retreating into her thoughts at night. News about Jay trickled in from other inmates with connections to the outside world. She learned that he had been adopted by a new family and had taken their last name. The realization struck her with the finality of a gavel. Her son had moved on, and she was a distant memory at best. Despite everything, Nicole clung to small victories where she could find them. She earned her GED, completed vocational training programs, and even took part in counseling sessions aimed at helping inmates cope with their circumstances. Yet a deep sense of injustice remained at the core of her being. She had been stripped of everything: her career, her motherhood, her freedom, and the fight for exoneration felt like an uphill battle with no end in sight. By 2013, Nicole had spent 14 years behind bars. The prison had become both a cage and a place of reluctant adaptation. She had seen fellow inmates come and go, some released, others returning, and some never making it out at all. The weight of lost time pressed heavily on her shoulders, and though she had grown accustomed to the rhythms of prison life, she never accepted it as her fate. In the depths of night, when the prison was at its quietest, she would lie awake and imagine what life might have been like if she had never been accused, never been convicted, and never been taken away from her son. The years had stolen much from her, but Nicole still held on to a fragile thread of hope. Hope that one day somehow the truth would come to light, and she would have the chance to reclaim what had been unjustly taken from her. By 2014, Nicole Harris had grown accustomed to the monotonous routine of prison life. Each day bled into the next, marked by the same dull repetition of early morning roll calls, silent meals in the overcrowded cafeteria, and long hours in the prison library where she found solace among legal textbooks and case files. Despite the passing years, hope remained a distant, fading concept. Letters to legal aid organizations had gone unanswered, and each denied appeal reinforced the growing certainty that she might never see freedom again. However, a flicker of hope emerged when she received news that Carl Johnson, the former attorney who had mentored her through years of self-study, was finally released from prison. Carl had spent the last decade guiding Nicole through the intricacies of the legal system, offering advice and strategies while encouraging her to continue fighting for justice. Upon his release, he promised to do everything in his power to seek out new evidence and push for her exoneration. Though skeptical, Nicole allowed herself a cautious glimmer of optimism. Carl wasted no time once he was back in the world outside. Leveraging his remaining contacts within the legal community, he reached out to an old acquaintance, Raymond Carter, a private investigator known for his meticulous approach and persistence. Carter, a former detective with a reputation for uncovering hidden details in cold cases, agreed to take another look at Nicole's file. Over the next few months, he combed through police reports, witness statements, and forensic records, determined to find something that had been overlooked in the original investigation. His efforts soon bore fruit. One of the first major discoveries was related to the key witness whose testimony had sealed Nicole's fate. A thorough background check revealed that the witness, who had testified under oath that he saw Nicole near the crime scene, had died several years earlier. Upon closer examination of archived police files, Carter uncovered significant discrepancies in the witness's statements. In early interviews, the witness had described an individual much shorter than Nicole and with distinct features that did not match her appearance. These inconsistencies had been dismissed during the original trial, buried under the prosecution's aggressive narrative. The second breakthrough came in the form of a long-lost forensic report. During the initial investigation, police had taken fingerprints from the crime scene, but the report had mysteriously vanished before the trial. After relentless searching, Carter managed to obtain a copy from an overlooked archive in the county records office. The report conclusively stated that the fingerprints found at the scene did not match Nicole's. This critical piece of evidence, if presented in court, could have changed the outcome of the case. Its absence from the original proceedings strongly suggested intentional suppression. Further investigation led Carter to Robert Wilkins' former business associate, who had worked closely with the victim before his death. Initially reluctant to speak, the man eventually admitted that Wilkins had been involved in serious financial disputes with several individuals, including himself. He detailed how Wilkins had been facing mounting pressure from creditors and legal threats. This revelation cast doubt on the original theory of the case, which painted the crime as a random act of violence rather than a targeted attack. Yet none of this information had been presented in court, as the prosecution had built their argument solely around Nicole's alleged presence at the scene. As Carter compiled these findings, he and Carl gathered the necessary documentation and presented it to Nicole's attorney. They worked tirelessly to prepare a comprehensive petition for appeal, outlining the flaws in the prosecution's case and the overwhelming new evidence suggesting Nicole's innocence. The legal team crafted a compelling argument that emphasized the failure of due process, the suppression of crucial evidence, and the mismanagement of the investigation. Meanwhile, within the prison walls, Nicole found herself feeling something she had not allowed herself in years: hope. The letters from Carl describing their progress reignited a sense of determination in her. She began to envision a life beyond the prison gates, one where she could reclaim her identity and perhaps, one day, reconnect with her son. The other inmates noticed a change in her demeanor. She carried herself with a newfound sense of quiet confidence, as though she was beginning to believe that justice might still be within reach. Despite this glimmer of optimism, Nicole remained cautious. She had learned the hard way that hope could be a double-edged sword. Still, she poured her energy into assisting with her own case, studying legal precedents in the prison library and refining her understanding of the appeals process. Every letter from Carl and Carter fueled her determination to fight, even when the legal system seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. As the appeal date approached, Nicole braced herself for the possibility of disappointment, but deep down she knew that this time felt different. The evidence they had uncovered was too strong to ignore, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, it seemed as though the truth might finally have a chance to be heard. In 2018, after years of failed appeals and unanswered pleas, Nicole Harris's case resurfaced in the public eye. The investigative work conducted by Carl Johnson and Raymond Carter had finally gained traction, drawing the attention of several journalists specializing in wrongful convictions and judicial corruption. A well-known investigative journalist published an exposé detailing the inconsistencies in Nicole's case, highlighting the suppressed forensic evidence, the unreliable witness testimony, and the deeply flawed trial that had led to her conviction. The article ignited public outrage and renewed interest in her story. Legal organizations advocating for criminal justice reform took notice, and Nicole's legal team filed a formal request for case review. The request outlined the newly discovered evidence, emphasizing the missing fingerprint analysis, the conflicting witness statements, and the suspicious handling of key evidence by law enforcement. The mounting pressure from the media and public opinion created a sense of urgency within the judicial system. In late 2018, the Illinois Court of Appeals agreed to re-examine her case, marking the first significant breakthrough in years. The retrial process began in early 2019. As the courtroom filled with reporters, activists, and legal experts, Nicole was transported from prison to stand before the judge once more. The prosecution, now under new leadership, faced mounting scrutiny over how the case had been handled 2 decades earlier. The defense presented the previously suppressed forensic report, proving that the fingerprints found at the crime scene did not match Nicole's. They also provided documentation showing that key pieces of evidence had been altered or omitted during the original trial. The most damning revelation, however, came during the testimony of a former police detective who had been involved in the initial investigation. Under oath, he admitted that pressure from higher authorities had influenced the direction of the case. He revealed that Judge Richard Banks, who had presided over Nicole's trial, had a history of disproportionately sentencing African-American defendants to maximum penalties in exchange for political backing and financial incentives from influential figures within the justice system. Evidence presented in court showed that Banks had frequently ignored exculpatory evidence and had manipulated court proceedings to favor convictions. Further investigation into Banks's career exposed a pattern of systemic corruption. Prosecutors, police officers, and forensic analysts were implicated in a broader scheme aimed at inflating conviction rates to boost their careers and political aspirations. Internal emails and financial records showed that Banks had received undisclosed payments from law firms representing private interests that benefited from mass incarceration policies. The shocking revelations painted a picture of a deeply corrupt system that had thrived at the expense of innocent individuals like Nicole. Amidst the legal proceedings, Nicole's now adult son, Jay, attended the hearings but remained distant. His posture was guarded, his expressions unreadable. Having grown up believing that his mother was guilty, he struggled to reconcile the new evidence with the image of her that had been ingrained in him for years. Though he listened intently to the unfolding facts, the emotional barrier between them was evident. The court proceedings stretched over several weeks, with the defense meticulously dismantling the prosecution's original case. Witnesses who had remained silent for years came forward, corroborating claims of misconduct and manipulation. Slowly but surely, the narrative began to shift, and the public's perception of Nicole transformed from that of a convicted criminal to a victim of a corrupt system. Finally, in the fall of 2019, the judge delivered a ruling that echoed throughout the courtroom. Nicole Harris was exonerated of all charges. The official declaration of her innocence was met with a mix of relief and disbelief. After 2 decades behind bars, she was free to walk out of the courtroom, no longer a prisoner, but a woman whose life had been stolen by injustice. However, freedom felt unfamiliar. The world outside had changed in ways she could scarcely comprehend. The city skyline looked different, technology had advanced, and the people she once knew had moved on. As she stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with a flurry of cameras and reporters eager to capture her reaction. But behind the relief in her eyes lay an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Nicole's exoneration did not erase the years of pain, loss, and missed opportunities. Her son, the child she had once cradled in her arms, was now a grown man with a life she had not been a part of. Friends she once trusted had disappeared, and the world she had left behind no longer felt like home. Though she had regained her freedom, she realized that reclaiming her life would be an entirely different battle. Nicole Harris stepped out of the correctional facility into a world that no longer felt like her own. The streets of Chicago, once familiar and filled with memories of her past life, now appeared alien and unwelcoming. She had imagined this moment countless times during her incarceration, envisioning freedom as a fresh start, a second chance to rebuild everything she had lost. But reality proved to be far more complicated. Her first days outside were filled with overwhelming challenges. The weight of 2 lost decades pressed heavily on her, manifesting in small yet painful ways. Crossing busy intersections, using unfamiliar technology, and navigating a society that had moved on without her. People around her seemed to exist in a different world, one she struggled to understand. She was no longer the young woman who had entered prison. She was now a middle-aged stranger in her own city. One of the most painful realizations was the distance between her and her son. Jay, now a grown man, had a life of his own, one that did not include her. He refused to meet, responding only through brief messages that expressed his reluctance to reconnect. He had built a life based on the belief that his mother was guilty, and even with her exoneration, the emotional wounds ran too deep to mend overnight. Nicole's attempts to bridge the gap only seemed to push him further away, leaving her with a painful void she had once filled with hope. Finding employment proved to be another daunting challenge. Despite her innocence being legally acknowledged, the stigma of a wrongful conviction lingered. Employers hesitated, their eyes scanning her application with quiet judgment. Her years of experience in healthcare were outdated, and potential employers viewed her as a liability rather than an asset. Job interviews were filled with awkward silences and forced politeness, leaving her feeling defeated and unwanted. Public scrutiny added to her struggle. Journalists followed her every move, eager to capture the story of the woman who had spent 20 years behind bars for a crime she did not commit. Headlines painted her as a tragic figure, and strangers on the street often recognized her, some offering sympathy, while others kept their distance, uncertain of how to treat her. The constant media attention made it difficult for her to blend into society and move forward quietly. Every reminder of her past played on an endless loop in the public sphere, making her feel as though she was still in prison, only in a different way. Determined to seek justice beyond her own case, Nicole filed a lawsuit against the state of Illinois, demanding compensation for the years she had lost. The legal proceedings uncovered even more unsettling truths. Her story was not an isolated incident. Dozens of African Americans had been wrongfully convicted under similar circumstances, victims of systemic failures and institutional racism. As the case gained traction, Nicole's voice became one among many, a symbol of resilience and the urgent need for reform. Her fight was no longer just about her freedom, but about exposing the deeper injustices that had destroyed countless lives. In the midst of her struggles, Nicole found a sense of belonging in a support group for formerly incarcerated individuals. The group provided a safe space where she could share her experiences without fear of judgment. Each meeting was a reminder that she was not alone in her journey. Others had walked similar paths, facing the same rejection and struggles to rebuild their lives. The group offered practical support, help with job searches, housing advice, and emotional guidance, all of which became lifelines for Nicole as she tried to find stability. Through the connections she made within the group, Nicole was introduced to a community organization that assisted individuals affected by wrongful convictions. She began volunteering, initially working behind the scenes, organizing files and assisting with outreach efforts. Over time, she took on a more active role, speaking at public events and advocating for policy changes aimed at preventing future wrongful convictions. Helping others who had suffered the same fate gave her a renewed sense of purpose, allowing her to channel her pain into something meaningful. Despite the progress she made, Nicole continued to battle the psychological scars left by her years in prison. Nightmares of her time behind bars haunted her sleep, and simple triggers, a loud voice, the sound of metal gates clanging, brought back vivid memories of confinement. She found it difficult to trust people, constantly questioning their intentions and struggling with the fear that everything she had gained could be taken away again. Therapy sessions provided some relief, but the road to healing was long and uncertain. As the year progressed, Nicole slowly adapted to her new reality. She learned to navigate the challenges of reintegration, finding small victories in everyday accomplishments. She secured a part-time job with the community organization, offering financial stability for the first time since her release. She continued to fight for justice, not just for herself but for others trapped in a flawed system. Yet the lingering pain of her fractured relationship with her son remained an unresolved wound, one that she carried with her every day. Nicole's journey after prison was far from the fresh start she had envisioned. It was filled with obstacles, setbacks, and moments of despair. But through it all, she remained determined to reclaim her life, to find meaning beyond the injustice that had defined her for so long. The battle for freedom had ended, but the fight for a new life had only just begun. In 2022, Nicole Harris found herself haunted by the lingering injustice that had shaped the past 2 decades of her life. Despite her freedom, the knowledge that Judge Richard Banks, the man responsible for her wrongful conviction, continued to live without consequence gnawed at her daily. Through news reports and quiet inquiries, she discovered that he resided in a luxurious suburban estate, far removed from the suffering he had inflicted. The opulent life he led, untouched by accountability, fueled a growing sense of anger within her, an emotion she had tried so hard to suppress. Compelled by a need for closure, Nicole began quietly gathering information about Banks. She researched his past rulings, financial records, and personal connections. Late into the night, she combed through online articles, court documents, and social media, piecing together a narrative that suggested his corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. She discovered patterns in his sentencing history: disproportionately harsh punishments for African American defendants, suspiciously close relationships with wealthy attorneys, and a lifestyle that far exceeded the income of a public servant. Her obsession grew slowly but steadily. She visited the neighborhood where Banks lived, observing the routines of his daily life from a distance. He seemed untouched by guilt, continuing his morning jogs, hosting dinner parties, and enjoying his retirement without a hint of remorse. Nicole's thoughts oscillated between seeking justice and the desire for something darker: revenge. The temptation to confront him, to demand acknowledgement for the years stolen from her, became an ever-present shadow in her mind. However, as the months passed, Nicole realized that vengeance would not undo the past. The weight of her experiences had taught her that anger alone could not bring her peace. Instead of acting on impulse, she turned to her legal team, sharing the information she had uncovered. Working together, they compiled a compelling case against Banks, tracing his financial transactions and uncovering hidden dealings that pointed to long-standing corruption. They presented their findings to federal investigators, who began their own quiet inquiry into his affairs. By early 2023, the investigation gained momentum. Testimonies from former court clerks and defense attorneys emerged, painting a damning picture of a man who had manipulated the justice system for personal gain. Evidence of falsified case records, suppressed exculpatory evidence, and large financial transfers to offshore accounts formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Nicole watched from the sidelines as the investigation unfolded, her heart torn between satisfaction and the lingering bitterness of lost years. The news of Banks's arrest spread quickly. The charges against him included corruption, falsification of judicial documents, and obstruction of justice. Cameras captured him being led out of his lavish home in handcuffs, his once commanding presence reduced to a disgraced figure, attempting to avoid the media frenzy. Nicole followed the coverage with a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and an unshakable sadness for everything she had lost along the way. With Banks finally facing consequences, Nicole sought solace in the one place she had long avoided: her mother's grave. Standing in the quiet cemetery, she reflected on the years her mother had spent fighting for her release, never seeing the day justice would prevail. The weight of grief settled heavily on her shoulders, but in that moment, she understood that seeking revenge would never have honored her mother's memory. Justice, however delayed, was the only path that truly mattered. As she prepared to leave, she saw a familiar figure approaching. Her son, Jay, stood at a distance, hesitant but present. It was the first time in years that he had willingly come to see her. There was no grand reconciliation, no immediate word spoken, but his presence alone signified a step forward. Nicole realized that healing, much like justice, required patience and persistence. In the end, Nicole chose to focus on the future rather than the past. She continued her work with advocacy groups, using her experience to help others wrongfully convicted find their voices. Though the scars of her imprisonment would never fully fade, she found purpose in ensuring that others did not endure the same fate. The pursuit of justice had brought her freedom, but it was her decision to let go of vengeance that finally set her free.